And thank you all for joining us today. This is the first webinar that we are hosting on this topic, and it coincides with the launch of our report on the changing nature of work. It is nice to see so many familiar faces on the list and so many new faces. As I mentioned, we had over 150 people or so register for this webinar from mining companies across the country, from all sizes. And from mining companies that are international. We have a number of colleges and universities online, as well as government representatives, both federally, provincial, territorial, and even indigenous governments as well. So thank you for being here. We're certainly very excited to be launching this report. It's the culmination of really 2.5 years of work for our team. Our initial plan was to launch this at the CIM event in Vancouver earlier this month. But obviously, because of COVID-19 and everyone's inability to travel, we decided to host this webinar instead. I also wanted to mention that the research that you're going to get a glimpse into today does not factor in what's happening currently with respect to COVID-19 and the pandemic. Obviously, that's having a major impact on the workforce, and we will be looking and delving into that issue of the pandemic over the course of the month and over the course of the summer and the fall. So please stay tuned for some labor market information and some research on that through our social media channels along the next few months. So with that, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Montpellier, and I'm the Executive Director at the Mining Industry Human Resources Council. And once again, welcome to our webinar today on the launch of our report on the changing nature of work. Let me just go through the slides here. So our presentation today, I will kick things off, provide you with a brief overview of the Council and the objectives of the report. And then I'll pass things over to the experts that really were the authors of the report. Dr. Erin Mills is our Director of Labor Market Research, and Jamie Wolcott is MiHR's Chief Economist. And both Erin and Jamie are, and their respective teams were really the authors of the report. They did the primary research. They were in the field interviewing many of you on this line. And also did all of the quantitative analysis and data analysis in this report. So they'll cover most of the findings of the report. I will come back towards the end for a brief summary and try to facilitate a Q&A. Please use the Zoom platform for that Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. At the same time, try to respect our time frame and wrap this up in about an hour. So that's the plan. Let me kick things off here with just a brief slide on who we are at the Council. MiHR, for those of you who don't know us, MiHR is an independent, nonprofit organization with a mandate to help build an inclusive, skilled, and sustainable Canadian mining workforce that anticipates and adapts to volatility and innovation. We work across the Canadian mining sector to understand labor market trends and identify opportunities and solutions to try to build a more efficient labor market. One of the key strengths of the organization, we're a small team, only 20 of us, but one of the key strengths is a network of over 250 industry volunteers from across the sector that collaborate on various project committees, advisory committees, consortiums, standing committees, to help guide the work of the Council. And it was no different for this report as well, and I should thank our LMI committee that fed into this report. Our board of directors, again, is a cross-section of employers that are from a number of different geography and commodities, and tend to be senior HR leaders in those organizations. But also included on our board are organized labor with steelworkers and Unifor, post-secondary educational institutions with Collège Boréal, as well as various associations and consultants or contractors. Now, last year, MiHR launched a new strategic plan that outlines 4 key pillars to help address those labor market challenges. And contained in those pillars, we have a number of programs that address things like skills development, national standards, worker certification, worker mobility. We have tools to help build an inclusive and diverse workforce, and specifically training programs to help companies attract, recruit, and retain more women, more immigrants, more Indigenous people as well. We also have a number of tools for students to help give them more awareness about the careers that the mining industry offers. We have career quizzes and career maps, career profiles and videos. And one of our key programs is called Gearing Up, and it's a program that is about trying to create more co-op opportunities for students in our sector. And I'm happy to say that in the last few years, we have helped fund the creation of 500 new co-op opportunities in the mining industry. And our goal this year is to do 500 more. So if you are considering hiring a student this year, please do so, especially if it's in a co-op role. We can certainly help you and subsidize a portion of that to the tune of up to $7,000. So please, certainly reach out to us. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of the strategic pillars of the organization today, but I did want to focus just on that co-op program, and also focus on that first pillar of labor market information, because that's really at the essence of why we're here today, is to talk about LMI. And MiHR has been doing labor market information now for the better part of 15 years. And part of LMI is just the understanding of the supply and demand of workers, and identifying trends and challenges and opportunities that mining companies, that post-secondary education, that governments can make informed decisions on how to build a more efficient labor market. And we've done labor market research now at the national level, and we produce an annual report on the state of the Canadian labor market every year. We also produce labor market research on the mineral exploration sector with the PDAC. But we also do labor market research specifically for mining companies. We do it specifically for provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments. We've done it for post-secondary institutions that are looking to either create a new program relative to mining or related to mining, or trying to sustain an existing program. So my message to you is, if you're interested in better understanding your local community, the region in which you pull a workforce from, please give us a call, because we have a team of researchers and economists and all of the required data to produce, responsive and intelligence on the labor market. And part of that labor market research led us to this report and to this project, really, on the changing nature of work. Because as part of our research and as part of us forecasting future hiring requirements, we always knew that technology was significantly transforming our sector, and we needed a better understanding of how those technologies were impacting the workforce. So today, we know that technology is transforming how we find, how we build, and how we operate mines in Canada. The mining sector today is accessing deeper, narrower, more complex, and certainly more remote ore bodies than ever before, and technology is enabling that. Now, there's a number of very clear and distinct benefits to the implementation of some of these new technologies, like automation, and they are, clearly from a productivity standpoint and from reduced costs, its contribution to health and safety, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Those benefits are quite clear. What's less clear is the impact that some of those technologies are having on people. And that's really what our primary research objective was to increase our understanding of how these new technologies were impacting the workforce. And when we started this project, we set off with 4 key questions that we were trying to answer. And they were, what new technologies are currently being implemented in our sector? Who will be disrupted by these technologies? Because ultimately, that's what we were trying to explore. How will these skills requirements change? And what can mining stakeholders do to better prepare for this inevitable change? And that really was the guiding principle for the study that we launched. So hopefully that was just a very brief introduction to the study. I will now pass things over to Aaron, who will lead us through some of the qualitative research, and then Jamie will take over from there. So Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're incredibly excited to be presenting the material to you today and the release of the report. We're only going to present a small slice of what's contained in the report. As you know, technology and investigating it is a daunting task, and this report has a number of components. We'll just flip over to the next slide here. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. And the benefits of working off-site and in our home offices with dogs and kids. But the study was it included a quantitative and a qualitative component to the study. And I'm going to focus on the qualitative side of things. So we had 125 Canadian mining stakeholders with direct relevant knowledge of the Canadian mining sector input into the research. We conducted an extensive literature review. And as you know, the literature is vast and rapidly changing. And it was conducted over a year ago. So there's a lot of new research that's out there. We understand that, we recognize that. But certainly a very detailed literature review is contained in the report, which we hope you read. We conducted an online survey, a focus group, case studies, and validation sessions to capture a broad spectrum of views and expertise. I wanted to say thank you first to all of the stakeholders, and many of them are on the line today and joining the webinar, who participated in the research and provided valuable insight, and we appreciate that very much. I also would be remiss not to thank the LMI team, and thank you very much to Jamie and Gustavo and Lindsay for conducting the research. And today I'm just going to focus on the qualitative side of things, and then I'll pass it over to Jamie to talk about the quantitative. So just a little bit about the literature. There was a number of key findings from the literature. We conducted this is the very first step that we had. So I should say that first, to clarify, the way we've defined new technologies, and we've seen a variety of ways that it's been defined in the literature, but for the purposes of this report, we've defined new technologies as any new and or emerging technological innovation intended to increase mining efficiency and effectiveness in relation to impacting skills requirements, workers, and communities. And I apologize for reading my notes, but that's a long quote. But I just wanted to highlight some of the key findings. The pace of adoption and implementation is slow and uneven and likely to peak over the next 10 to 15 years. So it's not going to be an overnight process. And we have seen some literature that suggests that it's, there's a critical situation happening. And what we've seen in the literature is that globally it will peak out over the next 10 to 15 years, but take a little bit of time. We will see some job loss as a result of the implementation of new technologies, but it's also going to result in new jobs. So new jobs are going to be created in autonomous equipment, data processing. But again, we'll likely to see some job loss in operational jobs. And this is an area of concern for us as they currently constitute over 70% of mining employment in Canada. Okay, so the next slide. So when we conducted our research through the interviews and the different consultation processes that we did, the data suggested we could capture it around two main themes, and that was the changing nature of work in mining. And we asked mining stakeholders a number of key questions, such as how will new technologies change the nature of mining work? Will it improve mining worker health and safety? Which occupations are going to be vulnerable? How will it affect diversity and inclusion efforts? Very concerned. How will it affect Indigenous groups? And what about the retention of employees? And again, what we heard could be organized around two main themes: the changing nature of work. Our stakeholders suggested that there's a strong incentive to implement new technologies. There's benefits to worker health and safety, increased productivity, cost reduction, improved competitiveness, and strengthened environmental sustainability. What people did tell us was that there was a wide range of views on whether or not jobs are going to be lost or gained, but there was concern. There was some reluctance and resistance and caution noted by companies and employees to the adoption of new technologies. And we did see a bit of a change with respect to age. Some older employees suggested that they were more concerned about the the implementation of technologies and how it would change their jobs. But we did see that there are some opportunities and challenges for diverse groups, but again, caution was noted with how it would impact Indigenous communities. So for example, if we introduced remote technologies where we attracted more recent immigrants, would that shift the balance with Indigenous communities? So there was a number of things that emerged. I'd like to share with you some of the quotes that emerged from the research on this particular theme. So we heard technology is a cost saver, a health and safety issue, an improved monitoring issue, better use of information issue, and a performance issue. I think that kind of sums it up. Technologies will not necessarily provoke a reduction in the workforce, but a fundamental change within it. There's a huge risk of miscommunication when a new technology is adopted, and there needs to be buy-in from employees for successful implementation. And the last quote, there's a lot of quotes in the report, so we invite you to read that again, but leveraging these technologies could increase the number of well-educated and skilled people interested in mining work. So as these quotes exemplify, stakeholders express considerable interest in implementation of new technologies. The second theme that we noted from the research, the qualitative research, was increasing skills requirements. We asked stakeholders, will new technology shift skills requirements? Which skills will be in demand? How? And how should mining companies prepare? And what is the role for post-secondary institutions? These interviews, I should note, some of them were an hour long and were very detailed, so we did get tremendous insight into what was happening. Stakeholders responded that lifelong learning and training is key. New technologies may increase access to employment for some, but negatively impact others, as we saw from the earlier slide. And interestingly, gamification of mining and the ability to work off-site will attract younger, more technically savvy and diverse workers. Future workforce needs to be flexible and adaptable, and again, an increased need for both soft skills and technical skills. So these are some of the quotes that we heard, and you can see here under understanding skills requirements, or increasing skills requirements. Understanding and working with new technologies require skills to evolve. New rules will be created, new roles will be created, including those that don't exist, and our understanding of technologies and awareness of how we apply them will be critical. Innovative changes are good for diversity. It broadens the approach to diversify talent and allow us to attract new people with new skills and open up the workforce. And lastly, we heard we need curious people wanting to learn and maintain and grow their knowledge and embrace new technologies. And I should note here again that this was raised repeatedly through the interviews. There was some reluctance and some hesitation from employers and employees, and change indeed is difficult. We had the opportunity to conduct some case studies as part of our qualitative research, just to further our understanding of how technology is impacting Canadian mining work. We conducted 3 case studies located in Quebec, Newfoundland, and Ontario to explore how companies are using new technologies to help improve work efficiencies and training practices. We also took the opportunity to interview employees as part of our, to broaden our understanding on how the technologies are impacting the way they do their work and how they feel about it, and which skills they believe are increasingly in demand. We worked with Agnico Eagle, Anaconda, and Norcat. They were the 3 groups that participated in the case study research. And I should say a huge thank you for the warm welcome and the ability to go on site and to have a look at things that were happening. Highlights of the case studies include, again, we've got a lot more details in the report that we hope that we visit. Agnico Eagle's piloting of autonomous vehicles, underground and related training for control room operators. Anaconda's implementation of sustainable mining by drilling and development of the Anaconda University Training Platform. Norcat's Advanced Simulation Training Center, where operators can sit in the driver's seat in order to be trained efficiently and economically. And lastly, using these findings, we were able to inform and guide the direction of the next section of the report, which was the quantitative analysis that Jamie and his team handled. And I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to talk about these exciting findings. Again, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Erin. So I just want to thank everyone for joining this webinar. I'm really excited to share this quantitative side of the research. So this has really been an emerging topic in recent years, and we have certainly been inspired by a number of excellent contributions. I'm happy to share you our take today. So as Ryan said, while innovation and technology is a central theme, we always come back to the impact on workers in the labor market. So to do this, we tackled 2 main ideas. The first being occupational vulnerability. So that is, who will potentially face the greatest impact? And the second idea that we go at is how emerging technologies may shift future workforce skills. So these are the two agenda items for this presentation that I'm going to go through. And here we go. Okay, so we start with occupational vulnerability. So this section is an occupational analysis. We are interested in which occupations are exposed to the downside risks of innovation. So in other words, we're asking who may be vulnerable and then why. And we're certainly hopeful that this information can be used to make informed decisions, which, that may include strategies and tools to mitigate the risk for those who are vulnerable. And ultimately, our objective here is to identify where we should focus our attention and resources so that we can develop a stronger labor market. Okay, so I think everyone is clear on the upside of innovation. So whether that's health and safety, environmental benefits, cost reduction. The downsides, however, are a little more ambiguous. For example, the extent of disruption still remains unclear. In other words, how far will new technologies eventually go? We're also unsure of the pace of technological disruption. So a new technology might exist, but that doesn't guarantee it will be immediately adopted or integrated into an operation. So the example we like to pick on is self-driving cars. These have existed for several years now. And we all think of this as a potentially disruptive technology, but we are certainly less certain on the extent of this change. So that is how many jobs will be lost, which jobs will be lost, such as is it a driver, is it a mechanic? We're also unsure about how quickly this will unfold. So is it 5 years, is it 10 years? So if we are concerned with vulnerability, then timing is important. So in other words, if I have 30 years to plan for my job to be replaced, then am I really being disrupted? There are also several factors that are at play that determine whether a new technology is going to be an issue for potential workers. So, such as whether that technology is feasible, its capital expenditure, its prices, markets, that kind of thing. So what is the challenge? These uncertainties present us with challenges in answering our primary question, that is, who is vulnerable and why. And they also make it difficult for people to navigate the labor market. So workers may want to know what skills will be marketable, not just now, but in the future. And employers want to understand their labor market so that so if it can sustain their needs. So how do we address this challenge? So our team has developed labor market information, or LMI, which is another way of saying we want to use this data to measure the problem. So we do this by looking at several indicators that gives us clues regarding which occupations may face the greatest risks. And then what we did was we aggregated those into one composite score that gauges the occupational vulnerability. So we want to pack this information into one number, and we are able to, such that we'd be able to look at this number and signal to ourselves, am I vulnerable? So there are other well-known examples of an index that combines several variables. This includes the S&P 500, the CPI, the Human Development Index, among others. So we're sticking to this idea, and we're going to introduce MiHR's Occupational Vulnerability Index, or MOVI, for those who like acronyms. So the idea of this is to provide a signal of workers who are found to have the most exposure to the downside risks of automation. And later in this presentation, we want to understand how certain occupations are uniquely vulnerable. So what makes an occupation vulnerable? Our framework looks at two main criteria. So the first one we call technological disruption. So in other words, is a robot coming for my job? And the second one is we call worker adaptability. So in the event that I am disrupted in some way, am I able to stay on my feet? To get closer to the answering these questions, we start to characterize certain sub-themes. So under technological disruption, we're interested in 3 of those sub-themes. So the first one is scope of innovation. So is there a technology capable of doing your job currently or in the future? The second one is incentives for disruption. So is there an incentive for an organization to bring in job replacing technologies? So this could include economic, environmental, and safety incentives. And then finally, we're looking at things like social and regulatory obligations. So are there any hurdles that must be cleared before job replacing technologies can be adopted? So under worker adaptability, here we're interested in two sub-themes. One is the transferability of skills. So do my skills overlap with other roles in the economy? The second one is geographic labor mobility. So this is talking about the ability to move closer to alternative employment. So together, these factors kind of push and pull on an occupation's vulnerability. And we can insert any occupation into this model. For example, if we think about truck drivers, that's a common one to think about. So we could say, is there a technology that could replace a truck driver? Are there incentives to adopt these technologies? Are there social or regulatory barriers to adopting those? Do truck drivers have a skill set that translate to other job opportunities? And finally, are truck drivers limited to certain geographies? So we did this exercise for 120 occupations, and we used this framework as a roadmap for gathering data. Now, I won't have time to go through all of this today. And again, this information would be in the report. But what we've done is we've gathered key variables and indicators that characterize our themes. And from there, we built a composite score. To build that score, we've considered several methods. Ultimately, though, we followed the OECD handbook for building composite indicators. And I also want to note that we can build on this in future iterations if, as things evolve and maybe we get better data. In many ways, this is a pilot, and we are looking to improve upon this foundation moving forward. So we use this framework for, as I mentioned, for 120 relevant occupations. These include everything from underground miner to mechanic to engineer to geologist. And what we did was we produced 120 MOVI scores. So a MOVI score will range from 0 to 1, with 1 being the most vulnerable, and 0 being the least vulnerable. And each one of these will incorporate all of the ingredients of this framework compiled into one number. So now I'm going to get to the outcomes of this. So this is what they look like on a histogram. Fairly nice distribution. At this point, we want to know, what is a bad MOVI score? So if I told you your MOVI score was a 0.58, should you be concerned? So like other industries, the only way to interpret is in comparison to other scores. So some takeaways from this, the average occupation has a MOVI score of 0.44. The middle 50% of occupations shown in that blue segment are between 0.32 and 0.54. So if you're above that level, you're in the top 25%. We're saying you're relatively high. And if you're below that level, you're relatively low. So now we have a way of knowing which occupations are, may have a relatively high MOVI. We want to now know how many people are in those occupations. So here's the distribution of MOVI scores for the roughly 70,000 workers in mining and quarrying. Again, the typical mining occupation has a score of 0.44. The typical mining worker has a score of 0.57. And we can see that distribution is skewed to the right, as there are several mining workers in occupations with higher MOVI scores. Another way to visualize this is in this picture. So each point corresponds to an occupation. On the vertical axis, we have the MOVI score. So the more vulnerable occupations are higher in the graph. And on the horizontal axis, we have the size of the mining workforce in that occupation. So as we move up and to the right, we say that there is a higher exposure for the mining workforce. So these are the areas of concern. So just for example, we see the highest MOVI score is in underground miners. So that's at a 0.75. And this occupation also has the largest contingent of workers in mining and quarrying. So that gives us a signal that maybe we want to pay attention to this occupation a little further. Here we have a very similar graph as in the previous slide, but we have organized the 120 occupations into broad categories. And here we can see production occupations are in the so-called danger zone. In contrast, the least exposed occupations are the physical sciences, the HR, and financial occupations. Okay, so up until now, I have presented the MOVI as one number, and we acknowledge that that can't tell us everything. So the MOVI is only a rough indicator. So that means, in other words, we could have two occupations that can have the same MOVI, but for very different reasons. So we would like to unpack this a bit. So to do that, we use these spider charts. So this is a visualization that illustrates the different ingredients of the MOVI, and gives us a way to uniquely identify why an occupation is vulnerable so that we may have the right antidote and, again, make informed decisions. So these charts align with our framework, and the MOVI score is shown at the top at the 12 o'clock, and then going clockwise are the sub-themes that I had described earlier. So the greater the area on this picture, the greater exposure to disruption of technologies, or the greater vulnerability. So we can see it. We also provided a comparative reference for the average MOVI in all occupations and for the specific occupational category. So here I've provided three examples. The largest MOVI on the left there, that's underground miners. The smallest MOVI is in the middle, so that will be industrial engineering mechanics. And on the right, I added construction millwrights. And I added that one because it illustrates how we might use this information. So we can see millwrights have a relatively average size MOVI, but the transferability of skills is not really a contributing factor in this case. So if we are thinking about mitigating exposure for millwrights, maybe transferability of skills is not going to be the most effective route in that case. So you can see how every occupation has sort of a unique flavor of what makes them vulnerable. And we want to consider those things as we navigate the solutions. So that concludes the MOVI. So the second stage is to look at future workforce skills. So while the previous section is very much an occupational analysis, this section is going to look at skills. I just want to say, though, skills are still rather abstract. There is no commonly accepted definition or measurement of skills. For our purpose, we used what's called the ONET database, which is a data set produced by the US Department of Labor. So they've identified 35 basic skills that are used in several occupations. So we first converted this data for Canadian occupations, and then we use this to provide a measurement of skills. So our objective here is to have some kind of observation of the skills that are being used in the mining industry. And then from there, we want to investigate how this might be different considering emerging innovation and technologies. So we developed a rather straightforward analysis with that goal. Before I go through that, I first want to acknowledge there's a few limitations of this analysis. So while the focus is on skills, the analysis necessarily leverages occupational data. That data is obviously going to be limited to the occupations of today, so we can't crawl into occupations that don't exist yet. Next, the analysis does not predict the future production mix. So if we think of the production mix as the combination of labor and capital, so capital being stuff like trucks and machines, buildings, then this analysis doesn't develop any forecast of this. So rather, we're going to develop a few scenarios, which I'll get into. Lastly, this analysis does not rank skills in any way. So for example, we don't say that a manager uses leadership 50% of the time, or that leadership is the most valuable skill. So rather, we're just asking whether a manager uses leadership, yes or no. And just as a final bullet, I want to mention that this analysis is not about predicting the future. Rather, it's intended to be seen as a diagnostic, and we're looking for directional change and what is significant here. So before I get into our measurement of skills, I just want to show a couple of interesting pictures. So this graph shows the ratio of capital input to labor input in the mining industry since 1980. And we can see that there is indeed a trend of capital intensification that has occurred over that time. And over the same period, we see a shift in educational attainment. So as the industry was becoming more capital intensive, they were also employed more people with a post-secondary education at the same time. So a shift in capital and in the labor skills is not unprecedented in this sector. So that leads me back to MiHR skills analysis. So we want to know that, I was just going to say, we do know that mining capital can change, and we know that labor skills can change. So to analyze this further, we followed a rather simple approach. So recall, the idea is to get a baseline of the skills that are currently being used in the industry. So step one is to attribute skills to occupations. So we're creating a mapping of skills to occupations in this case. As I mentioned, we had leveraged the ONET database for this task. And we say that if a skill exceeds a certain threshold for both importance and level, those are ONET things, then it belongs to that occupation. So again, we're interested in the binary result. Does an occupation use a skill, yes or no? And then step two is simply just to aggregate all of the workers using that particular skill. So let me provide just a simple analogy that may make this rather straightforward. We like to think of a skill as a tool, such as a wrench or a screwdriver, and an occupation as a collection of tools, like a toolbox. So our approach basically attributes tools to certain toolboxes. So in this case, skill one goes to occupation A. It happens to not go to occupation B. And then we add up all the workers using skill one. So, for example, if we know an engineer has skill one in their toolbox, and we know how many engineers there are, then we have a partial estimate for how many workers are using skill one. And then we aggregate across all occupations for a total estimate. So we do this for two scenarios. One is assuming no technological change. We call this the baseline scenario. And the other scenario is assuming both skills in the toolboxes will change and the number of workers with those skills will change. So that's what we call the innovation scenario. In many ways, these two scenarios represent two extremes. I just will also mention that we use the qualitative side of the research to inform certain assumptions that went into the innovation scenario. And I'm going to show the results of this. Again, our objective is to point to the direction and potential magnitude of shifting skills stemming from emerging technologies. Before I do that, though, I just want to point to what the ONET skills were, in case you were curious about that. So there are 35 of them. These are the 10 that we have chosen for the purpose of this analysis. And again, this is in the report. And here's our results. So the baseline scenario is shown as that black circle, a black line and circle, and the innovation scenario is represented by yellow columns. And we can see the directional change for each skill. So a couple of observations out of this. The majority of the skills are anticipated to increase under the innovation scenario, notably judgment and decision-making, reading comprehension, complex problem solving, and active learning. Critical thinking continues to be the most widely used skill, with close to 90% of the mining workforce requiring this skill set, the skill in their skill set. A couple of exceptions include operation control, operation monitoring, and operation and control, which are expected to decrease, yet still remain prevalent with close to 60% of the workforce using those skills. Finally, interestingly enough, programming remains the least commonly used skill among the workforce, even as it is expected to be used in a slightly larger number of occupations. just to summarize this, so what we offer here is a simple approach to quantify the skills that are being used within Canada's mining labor force. We're acknowledging certain limitations in quantifying workforce skills. Our ultimate goal here is to provide an initial reference point for comparing how various skills are represented and how they may evolve as new technologies are introduced. So the idea is for career seekers, employers, educators, governments to use this information to better align the labor supply skill set with those predicted to be in greatest demand. So that concludes my section. I want to turn it over to Ryan to provide concluding remarks and maybe then turn over to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie and Aaron, to both of you. Hard to provide the entire scope of the research and the report in a sort of 45-minute presentation, but kudos to both of you for trying to do that, and hopefully there's already a few questions coming in. Maybe just a few concluding remarks from me on this. You know, I think we have covered the benefits of technological advancement and the benefits they have to the sector. Again, we are just at the beginning of our analysis of trying to measure the impact this has on the workforce. We are not saying that this is, you know, the solution, or this is going to be the, you know, we're not trying to forecast, you know, the skills requirements or the occupational breakdown or the size of the workforce in 5 or 10 years from now, but just to give us a better understanding of how our industry is changing, and ideally get a better sense of what we can do today to better prepare for those individuals who are at risk of disruption, and ensuring that you know, we continue to invest in a skills development approach to support you know, people who are acquiring the skills for the jobs of the future, not necessarily for the jobs of the past. So part of that was echoed quite substantially in the qualitative research and the commitment to continued skills development and online sort of commitment to education and lifelong learning. Next slide, Jamie. As a final point, as I mentioned, this for us was phase 1. We are hoping to continue to explore occupational vulnerability in other countries, and we have looked already at some of those other countries, and will continue to do so. There's also a number of initiatives underway in terms of collaboration across other sectors of the economy. Last year, there was a new organization set up by Employment and Social Development Canada called the Future Skills Centre, and their mandate is specifically to look at the impact of technology and how it's changing the nature of work across all sectors of the economy, not just mining. So there's a lot of attention today on these topics, and we'll continue to explore this, and this just being sort of the first kick at the can. So with that, it is now you know, 1:45. We do have some time for some questions, and I have a few of them that are coming in here on the Q&A platform on Zoom. So if you do have other questions, please feel free to add them, and I'll try to go and tackle all of them here. Let me start with one of them. So question number 1, this one probably to you, Jamie. How does this relate to MiHR's forecast for Canadian mining employment? Does this report, this analysis, take into account job loss due to innovation?
Thank you, Ryan. So I would just say that this work that we've presented today does not, at this time, integrate with our regular forecasting. So our regular forecasting mainly deals with regular macroeconomic factors such as prices, interest rates, GDP, exports, that kind of thing. Innovation invites, as I explained, another layer of uncertainty that we are just beginning to explore. So, you know, again, we don't know how large some of these effects will be, and we also don't know the time horizon, which are two very key things to know when you're developing a forecast of anything. So So the idea here was to develop a capacity to understand innovation and the job market. And then as we move forward, integrate this into our ongoing analysis. And I think this is our first step in foraying into that work. So thank you.
Sounds good. Another question here, specifically on the MOVI, from CICAN, and this is, hi Mir, I'm really enjoying the webinar, so that's great. Thanks for that, Christine. On worker adaptability, I'm curious to know why availability of and willingness to take training isn't included as a variable.
It certainly could be. What we've done is we've developed things with the data in mind, and what we did was we combed the lit and saw certain various factors that might contribute to vulnerability. And so in many cases, this was the foundation 1.0 of what we feel makes something vulnerable. But we certainly are inviting, what we hope to do is actually invite more dialogue on this and more sort of feedback from stakeholders, and maybe understand better about this issue, and definitely have a conversation about building other factors in. So that factor for sure sounds immediately off the top of my head a great one. So thank you. Good comment, question.
Yep. Aaron, this might be more for you. In the qualitative research, any surprises from the interviews?
Actually, yes, and that's always a good sign when you're doing qualitative research. There were quite a few surprises. I think for me, one of the biggest surprises was the extent of the interest, and just the enthusiasm for the report and for the research that we were conducting. So that was a great surprise. And the support that we received was also a surprise, because when you're doing research, people suffer from a bit of fatigue. So it was very encouraging. One of the biggest surprises was the cautionary notes that were given, how many people expressed caution in terms of implementing technologies too fast, just moving them too quickly. I thought many of the mining companies that we spoke to were very respectful and very thoughtful in their approach to the implementation of new technologies, which was not a surprise, but it was definitely very, very nice to hear. Very nice to hear that they were really taking into consideration the employees' views and how it would impact employees, and just in terms of how it would increase diversity, the efforts that we were making around diversity, and that it would increase access to a lot of new workers. So I think those were surprises for me. I mean, there were lots of surprises along the way, but those were certainly some of the few that stand out.
One of the surprises to me as well in reviewing the report was just the impact that this new technology can have on the diversity of the workforce. Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of work in this area, and we know that, women, Indigenous people, new Canadians, women and Indigenous people are underrepresented relative to the rest of Canada. Indigenous people are the mining industry is the largest private sector employer of Indigenous people, but there's still lots more inclusion and diversity that can happen. But just the opportunity to use, as the nature of work changes in our sector, to use this as an opportunity to diversify our workforce is just a tremendous opportunity. I see a number of questions here that have been asked, asking about reference to the report, and is it available to all participants? It is. The report was officially uploaded and launched, I believe, earlier this morning, so it is available on our website for download. So please have a read and feel free to circulate it. And if you have questions along the way or have comments, as Jamie indicated, we are hoping to make this an ongoing dialogue. So if you do have specific feedback on the report or have specific questions, we would be happy to explore those as well. I'm looking at other questions here. I see a question here. Now the game is changing. Is there a strategy to actively and logistically support the true engagement and inclusion with these anticipated changes? If so, how will this be implemented and who will carry this out? Good question. I think this this topic, and maybe Aaron and Jamie, feel free to jump in. We know that the fundamental relationship between mining companies and communities is going to evolve as a result of new technology, and from a social license to operate, employment and local employment has always been part of that discussion. It's always been a big part. Certainly there's procurement, and there's in many cases now with new IBAs, we're seeing even equity partnerships being formed. But employment has always been the one of the main relationships between a mining company and its community. And if we start seeing technology change that relationship, I do think it will, from a purely social license to operate standpoint, provide an opportunity for a different kind of engagement or different kind of consultation at the very least. So certainly we're seeing that, and that did come out in some of the qualitative research as well. There's a number of other questions here. Let me just try to get to a few there.
Hey, Ryan,
yeah.
I just want to jump in on this last question. I don't feel like I know the true answer of it, who will carry this engagement strategy out. But what I do want to add is what we tried to build into this conversation is beyond the sort of the gearhead conversation. So, there's cool drones that exist. There's automated trucks. Wow, that's fun. But really crawl into the incentive to actually implement those things. And that really is some kind of layer of engagement that I can think of. Like, do I actually want to put this in my operation? That's the layer. The economic decision is the real what we tried to add value on here, rather than just talk about drones. And how they could replace somebody. It's more about, well, do I want them? Is this an expensive thing to have? Is this cause me a bunch of problems, regulatory problems? Is there motivation for me to adopt this? So.
Thanks for that, Jamie. The other question here on the diversity side, one of the questions, and Aaron, maybe this one's for you. The highest changes seem to be on complex problem solving, decision making, reading, and critical thinking. Knowing diversity is a big factor for the future on the mining workforce, and all of these changes are heavily influenced by cultural background. How will this risk be mitigated for diverse populations, in particular for immigrants, considering these are heavily influenced by culture?
That's a really interesting question, a really important question. And we did explore some aspects of that for sure in the research. And there was certainly a lot of talk about stronger linkages with post-secondary institutions and training institutes. Any kind of training provider or training that takes place at the workplace came out in the interviews. A lot of concern over how some of the skills would be mitigated and strengthened among all groups, including diverse groups. We have seen a lot of conversations around how recent immigrants come with skill sets, look for mining opportunities, but because of the nature of the remote work, if they were working in some more central locations, they may have access to better training opportunities, integration into the workplace. So certainly a big question, and definitely warrants a larger discussion.
Good. All right. Any other questions on here? Someone was asking for email addresses. They are available on our website. If you do want to reach out to any of the panelists, to Jamie, to Aaron, or to myself, you can please feel free and find us online. We'd be happy to have further these discussions there. And again, this is, like we mentioned, the first phase of this. If you want, to participate in future research that we plan on doing at the council, please reach out. And finally, just take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar. This was hopefully a useful way to spend an hour. And once you've had a chance to peek at the report and dig in a little bit deeper, if you have more questions for any of us, please feel free. So with that, thank you very much to everyone, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.